Chris Druce. I'm the news editor from Motor Transport magazine. It's a pleasure to be here. Bear with me, I'm taking the place of Christopher Walton, who did this very well last year. Just to add, he's not forgotten about you. He's moving house, and I had a text earlier that his entire life has been boxed up, and he signed it off with God bless haulage. So he is thinking of you, which is a great stuff. Luckily, you've got me, but you've also got 4 experts. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about where we see trucks going. Now, I couldn't resist though, as this is Truck to the Future, and I am of a certain age, it got me thinking of time-travelling DeLoreans, as you do, flux capacitors, etc. But more importantly, before we look to the future, of course, that film is about 30 years old now. And I thought it would be quite interesting just to look at essentially what were some of the flagship trucks from our archives back on the magazine, back 3 decades past. So hopefully this will work. So there you are, gentlemen, all flagship 1980s vintage trucks, as they now are, I guess. We've got the, I haven't got a code for that, someone can probably correct me. We've got simply a 1982 MAN, it says in our archive, with 240 brake horsepower. Scania 3 Series is up there, and a Volvo F16. Now, of course, these days we've got these marvellous vehicles. And I'd like to say, I mean, over the space of 30 years, back from when they were making that film, how far we've come. I mean, aren't these magnificent? TGX, the new Scanias, the new DAF XFs that we saw at the CV show. We've got the Stralis MP up there, which, as you'll be aware, recently went from all the way from Land's End to John O'Groats on 1 tank of fuel. I'm sure Martin can tell us a bit more about that in a minute. And I would also contend that if you took these trucks back 30 years, they would be science fiction, wouldn't they? We wouldn't believe that we would be driving around in vehicles such as this. And I suppose on that point I would add, it's quite exciting, isn't it? As we get into this debate, who knows what we're going to be driving, what form, and hopefully we're going to chat about this, these trucks are going to take in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So that's effectively what we're doing here. I'm going to introduce our panel here. I can promise you that I suspect where we're going, we will still need roads, but we've got experts here as well. So, gentlemen, you're in a slightly different order there, aren't you? So we've got Mark Grant there, UK After Sales Director of Scania GB. Thomas Hemrick, MD, MAN Truck and Bus. Thank you for being with us. We've got Martin Flack, Product Director at Iveco UK. And last but not least, Lawrence Drake, Business Planning Director at DAF Trucks. And I was going to ask the panel, throw this one out there, before we do go back to the future, if you'll pardon the pun. Just interested, what would you say is the development or the step forward that has stands out for you in, say, the last 10 years in technology, in terms of where we've come with our current vehicles that we've just seen, really? Anyone want to pick that up in that sense?
I'll kick off. To me, the big change between those vehicles and today's vehicles is the use of electronics. So pretty much everything on the vehicles we just saw would have been mechanical. And if you went into the workshop, you would have 10 mechanics and 1 electrician. The electrician changed the bulbs and fitted the radio. These days, you go into the workshop, and if a technician isn't able to use the laptop to do diagnostics, then he doesn't know where to start. So the engine is all electronics to control the fuel injection. We've got ABS brakes, we've got ASR systems, we've got ESP systems, we've now got AEBS systems, we've got lane departure warning, and we've got adaptive cruise control. All of these things are just the use of electronics to make the vehicle much safer and much more economical.
Anything to add from the panel there, Thomas?
Maybe to touch on this, I'm amazed about the reliability, because you touched on the electronics, and normally you would say as more electronics, as more tricky it is to keep the truck on the road. But I think for all the competitors here, the reliability is on a level where we've never been before.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Actually, if you sell a truck tractor now, within 3 years, you just see it for the oil change interval, and that's it, which is obviously a concern for the workshops, but that's a different story. Obviously, the operators are quite happy. But just to add on this, I'm amazed about the fuel efficiency. Because those trucks you've shown here, the average consumption was 45 liters of diesel per 100K. Sorry, I'm still on the continent, not miles per gallon.
That's 6 miles.
And now we are down at around 30 liters, which is 15 less. Within 20 years, it's significant. And we are still, as truck producers or as operators, the bad boys on the streets. I think we've achieved much more than the passenger car industry.
Agreed. And on that note, I wanted to ask, I mean, we've had lots of debate at the conference today on the issue of emissions, and we can broaden this out to the point you just made, that the improvements in fuel economy and also the triumph of the Euro 6 technology, certainly in HGVs. I've seen some articles more recently, and there seems to be a sort of, you know, also a political, if not popular, sentiment that was discussed earlier against diesel in that respect. I mean, to be controversial, has diesel become the new asbestos, for example? Is it the next? Is it the next? You know, health panic in that respect?
I think that it is going that way, and as an industry, we need to stop that, because diesel engines are going to be with us for many, many years. We will have alternative vehicles with alternative fuels, but let's not forget the diesel engine has been the core for over 100 years, and today with Euro 6 technology, very, very clean. And as I'm driving to work, listening to so-called commentators on the radio saying that diesel engines are polluting the world, it is wrong, and we need to address that because today those engines are as clean as you'll get, and they are not going to ruin the atmosphere. And I'm obviously picking up on the point that Quintus said earlier, which was the Liberal Democrats saying that they're going to ban diesel cars. Well, what about diesel trucks and those sorts of things? We just have to stop it and get people on the radio that know what they're talking about and talk sensibly about diesel, because we've got it for many years to come.
And we also had James Hookham's point earlier, and he gave us the exact measurement, which doesn't mean a lot to myself, 0.4 grams per kilowatts an hour. But the point, the takeaway from that was, it's very clean technology, isn't it, in HGVs? And it's been proven. Martin, you look like you want to come in on this.
I think just the point to make is that if you look at the changes of NOx and particulates from when we started the Euro emissions legislation, and if you look at how did the vehicle compare in real life to how did the vehicle compare on the the engine on the test bench, certainly in the Euro 4, Euro 5 period, there was some criticism that the real life emissions were not aligned with where the test bench emissions were and the legislation was. And there was some criticism against the manufacturers, which was unfair, because the way the legislation was written, the manufacturers were meeting the requirements of the legislation. In Euro 6, the test cycle has changed, which has enabled us to put in a cold operation. And what we see now is that the results on the road are very much aligned to where the legislation was taking us. So Euro 6 is actually making a bigger step change in real life than we would have expected just from the numbers going from 2 grams per kilowatt hour down to 0.4.
And do we, obviously we're seeing, although Euro 6 would qualify effectively, we're seeing the London ULEZ coming forward to April 2019. We will at some point possibly see some more clean air zones after the election, once the government publishes its report, I think in July. But it seems to be part of that, I suppose, anti-diesel sentiment there. But does that have any effect? I mean, obviously it's going to affect maybe second-hand sales as well and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a DAF perspective, the diesel is still the primary driver for us and the way forward. Making that truck as efficient as possible is obviously what we need to do. The way the industry is viewed is a problem, and we as manufacturers have to work with everybody to try and make sure it's seen better. The most efficient way to get goods moved is the largest vehicle possible on the most fuel efficient vehicle possible. So talking about a 44 tonner being no good, talking about diesel being no good is the wrong place to go. I mean, I think from a DAF perspective, the clean emission zones, obviously that legislation's come out. Well, the recommendation came out, which didn't really give anybody enough detail, I don't think, for us to really, as a manufacturer, hang our hat on and decide where we need to go. But I think longer term, it's making diesel as efficient as possible and moving to electrification down the road at some point, especially when you look at clean air zones.
And obviously, Thomas, sorry, please.
Actually, I'm afraid that the political environment is going to force us rather fast, sooner than later, into e-mobility. And if we like it or don't like it, because I'm also convinced that the diesel technology is for the next years to come by far the best technology. However, I think e-mobility will come very soon, because London was just mentioned, Paris is another example, Beijing is another example. And I think within the next maximum 5 years, we'll see various products from the various competitors based on e-mobility. And I'm not talking light commercials, I'm talking heavy commercials. There's no other way to distribute the foods, groceries into the mega cities like London.
Yeah.
I also think that the way in which logistics companies operate will change. So we see very much long distance being diesel, from warehouse maybe to distribution centres at the edges of big conurbations outside of London, and then perhaps hybrid or electric vehicles going in. And we see gas as a kind of in between that, particularly biogas. And I think over the next five years we'll see more specific vehicle builds to suit those types of operations. So in London, we currently are running a hybrid. It only does at the moment a few kilometres on pure electric, but the technology is gaining ground quickly. And I can see that we'll be using those electric vehicles, driving them from the distribution centre to the edge of a clean air zone and then through there on electric. And I think it's going to be a much more mix of individual vehicles that make up a fleet that's going to deliver what we have to do.
And is there a role to play? I mean, it's moving slightly away from the particulate issue, but in terms of, we've got very distinct design of European trucks. Are we going to see more done in terms of changing, for example, sloping front to the truck or devices on the back to improve the aerodynamics, etc., to gain extra fuel economy?
Potentially, you can do things on aerodynamics, but we need to divide there what are we doing for the vehicle running on the motorway, where aerodynamics is clearly an important part of the fuel consumption, and on the other side, the vehicle running in the city. So where it really takes us is to something which is more looking at moving away from one size fits all. At the moment, if you look at the market in the UK, people buy 3.5 tonne vans, a few 7.5 tonne vehicles still. They buy 18 tonne and 26 tonne rigids and 44 tonne 3-axle Arctics. Stop. So nothing else really appears in the market. And where we need to go to is, if we want to address air quality in the city and we want to address global warming on the main roads, we've got to look at the right product for the right application. And potentially what that will mean is that fleets need to go away from this ability to have one vehicle which will do anything and actually have vehicles which are dedicated more for specific operations.
Sorry, Thomas, did you have a...
The interesting point of your question actually touches to the whole Brexit discussion, because the biggest economies of scale you can get by the aerodynamics of the trucks, and as you did see, all those trucks are kind of flat noses. And if we would be allowed to be 20-30 centimeters longer, you can easily save 20% of fuel. Till now, the European legislation doesn't allow this to us, but maybe after 2019 we have some opportunities here, because this brings much more than Euro 6, 7, whatever we're going to get. If you can work on the aerodynamics of the tractor head or the rigid, whatever, this is the biggest fuel saver. And no one is willing to touch this from the governmental point of view.
But I also think that we don't need Euro legislation to make us produce vehicles that are more fuel efficient. This is what our engineers are working on day after day, and I think that if they don't have to concentrate fully on specifically the engine, we can now look at the whole vehicle, take out friction in drive lines, and we have been for many years chasing Euro 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and now it gives us time to look at the vehicle as a whole and start to work on honing the rest of the bits. And that's where the investment will go from the manufacturers in trying to get better fuel economy. If we don't use the fuel, we will reduce our carbon footprint anyway. And manufacturers are doing that. We don't need legislation to push us in that direction.
Okay. And I was just chatting earlier and we were discussing, pardon me if I get this wrong, about I believe it's the ACA and EC program Vecto. I think you've volunteered to say a little bit more about this, Martin.
A couple of words. Vecto is a calculation program which has been developed by the guys in the European Commission. And what it's looking to do is to actually take some typical trucks, and as manufacturers we put in data, and then you'll be able to run this program and simulate for your operation what the fuel consumption will be and what the CO2 would then be. Now, there's a lot of bad press of the car fuel consumption and CO2 data which is out there. And from what I've seen of Vecto, it's certainly a step forward from where the car data is, but it's never going to actually replace trying the vehicle in your operation. I'm yet to meet an operator who will believe anything I tell them on what the fuel consumption will be without actually trying the vehicle themselves.
It's the concept with that, though, back to what we were talking about earlier, getting to the point where you do have the right vehicle for the right job. For the
and ultimately, it should give people the opportunity to study that much better. But the aim will be that you can compare one vehicle with another. But of course, comparing one vehicle with another on a calculation routine is not the same as comparing one vehicle with another in your operation. We see it that if we do benchmarking ourselves, and I'm sure we all benchmark ourselves with other vehicles, depending on the route you do, you'll find that one vehicle is better than the other, and you do another route, and another vehicle is better than the other. Needless to say, the Iveco is always top, but...
But I would just like to add to that, though, that you've seen driver training taken up by all the manufacturers, and this is a major part of our future, to ensure that our vehicles are kept at peak performance, both in our workshops and then driven to peak performance. And I think I speak on behalf of the manufacturers, we've all got driver training now, we're all pushing forward with it, and that's a very, very important part of the vehicle. And I don't think that it's accepted as much in the market as it possibly could, because we want operators to get the most out of our vehicles. They pay a lot of money for them, and we want them to get the best value out of them. And I think it's an area that you'll see growing again over the next few years. And
of course, something that we've seen recognised at Microlise with the Driver of the Year awards.
Yes.
On that note, though, another sort of... please, Lawrence.
I was going to say, I think there's a crucial thing, and we've talked about it today. The truck, and like everyone's just said, they're very similar, different applications, whatever, you can look at them. But effectively, it is a computer in a vehicle. And I think the use of that information in that vehicle determines how that vehicle is used, the best way it can be used for an operator, the best network to deal with the servicing of it, where's it going, what time's it working. All these sort of factors need to be looked at from customers. So I think when you talk about a truck of the future, it is, we will all manufacture, or we're in competition, trucks that are probably going to be fairly similar going forward, if I'm honest. And what will happen is it's the results around legislation that lead a lot to what we have to change. And I think we'd probably all be in agreement that legislation to us isn't overly helpful, and the timescales, particularly when you look to London and their mayor in 5 years, you know, the investment, return on investment for some of our businesses on some of their whimsical changes become quite difficult. So I think from our point of view, we agree with where we think it should go. We know that the truck and the information is going to be key to making it efficient, and then you can start going on to automation. Where are we going with automation? Everyone uses automation today, cruise control, you know, the braking, etc. You know, DAF, we're looking at platooning. Do we think that we'll be able to platoon 10 trucks down the road? Probably not in the UK, but could we learn something from that? You know, the middle truck is 10% better fuel than the first truck. The last truck is 8% better fuel. Can operators leverage that themselves? I think there's lots of opportunities in that future, but I think at the moment, from probably a perspective, I don't think we're overly aligned when we talk to government and in terms of different areas of actually what we want to drive out of it.
Would you agree with that, panel?
Yeah, I think platooning is an interesting topic that we've all run trials with platooning vehicles. Last year there was a run from Brussels to Rotterdam that everyone took part in, using an Iveco vehicle with an Iveco vehicle, a DAF with a DAF and so on. So there's a lot of challenges to get to a point where you can actually create a platoon, which is a multi-vehicle platoon with a DAF, an Iveco, an MAN and a Scania all working in a line and all talking properly to each other and getting the vehicle to run, the 4 vehicles to run as one. And then you get to the challenge, so there's a lot of technical issues to get. Then you get to the challenge that I don't want to be the front vehicle, I want to be the middle vehicle because I'm going to get the best fuel consumption. Now, if I've got 4 vehicles belonging to one operator, that's fairly easy. But to get platooning to work well, I need multi-operator. So how do I sort out who gets the middle vehicle and who's up the front consuming more fuel?
Interesting, and I think we've just covered...
No, I think it's a valid point, and I think the point I was trying to make is, in going on the process of automation, there will be bits we learn from it that will make trucks more efficient. Wherever it ends up at platooning, who knows? But it starts at cruise control. So if you want to take it from there, it goes all the way up to wherever you see it. And only if you're on that journey will we then decide and benefit from wherever level we end up. But that's an experience that we'll obviously go through.
I would also add on that today we have a fully autonomous vehicle that works in mining operations, which has been a major help to mining operations because you can't put humans in a mine for 2 hours after a blast. But we've now got vehicles being driven, much as you see people controlling drones, putting vehicles into mines and collecting stuff out of it. But I don't think that's going to be on the road, but I think it does help us with developing technology. And platooning is one of those that I can't see it in the next 5-10 years, but at some stage I think we will have an adaptation of that, and we will have an adaptation of autonomous vehicles as well.
Maybe to add on this, actually, what is the advantage of platooning eventually? It's safety, but it's also driver shortage, as mentioned. And Quentin mentioned this earlier. Firstly, hands off and then brain off. And the platooning only really brings a benefit or value added if you don't need a driver anymore. Yeah. Because as long as a driver has to sit in the truck, what is really the value added? And honestly speaking, in between, what I'm amazed of now being here for a couple of months, being in Austria and Germany before, systems like efficient cruise, this is a GPS cruise control. The take rate is not very high, huh? And the safety advantage you have and the fuel advantage you have is actually significant. And the operators are not really, maybe we need to do better training, education, whatever, but it's lots of publications where it's highlighted. Go for this, it's going to help safety and fuel economy, but they don't touch this really.
I was thinking of the pilot we just covered this week that you're obviously working with DB Schenker. Yeah. And I believe that'll be in moving freight essentially from next year as part of several pilot phases. Coming full circle though, the DFT has been very keen on the concept. They were supposed to have trials in place last year, and that date went and gone. I mean, and listening to John Court at Stobart earlier, and he was a bit lukewarm about the idea himself, given the infrastructure we've got here. But I mean, panel, are we going to see even some trials of connected vehicles at least at some point in the UK, or are we down the list in that respect?
At some point, yes, but we're clearly, as most of us as manufacturers, all of our main research and development is being done in other countries. We're at the stage at the moment of research and development into platooning, which is very much test track close to home. And there's quite a lot of work to do on test track close to home before we get to the point where we would want to be testing in other countries. DFT have got a great desire to do something immediately, but I think the reality is that their desire and our ability to participate in something, there's a bit of a gap there at the moment.
Is that fairly consistent across the panel, or Thomas?
Actually, I think everyone is kind of ready to go for this, but especially now here in UK, I see a legal problem, product liability, because here this is completely different to the continent, and the big question is what is going to happen if something happens. And here I think you run a significant risk, and this is for me, for the time being, I think the showstopper, that we start platooning, because it needs to be very clear who's going to have what liability. And no one is willing to take this risk, at least from my point of view.
So there's a lack of leadership in that space at the moment,
Yeah.
I think we would say.
The issues will be where's the legal responsibility lie, but also if the vehicle is about to have a crash, what's the rationale? Do you crash into the bus stop? Do you crash into the other car? Do you crash? How do you do it? As a manufacturer, if we make that decision, then we become liable. Now it needs a much more broad societal approach as to, you as an individual will make your decision in a split second if you're about to have a crash, what you do. And hopefully you've got all of the ethics behind you which will get it right. But the vehicle will only do what it's been told to do.
Fair enough. We'll watch the space.
And I think it's a valid point, all of us. I think the technology can do a lot of things, but then you run into legal legislation that makes these things more challenging for all of us.
On another issue that seems to be dictating design, and Lawrence, you mentioned it earlier when you alluded to local rules. Obviously, we've just had, I think, 6 metro mayors elected around the country with certain powers over transport. We obviously have a very active role that TfL is playing in London with things like the direct vision standard, which will take a certain amount of vehicles that don't conform off the roads in just a few years now. What are your thoughts, panel, on this kind of devolution of powers, and there's almost a fragmentation of rules for people to contend with?
I think it creates a problem for us, obviously. I mean, it creates a problem, let's face it, for everyone in logistics, because I can't remember the actual percentage, but a high percentage of vehicles all end up going in London, even wherever they are in the UK. So then, wherever you're buying a truck, you need to be aware maybe of the London rules, for instance. But the dilemma from a manufacturer is, do we build trucks for the London rules, or is it the Paris rules, or is it the Manchester rules? And if none of those rules are the same, then it becomes almost impossible for us to, to work in that way. So I think from our point of view, let's be clear, we all want safety, the direct standards. We understand, we don't want cyclists being killed or any of that. So I don't think any manufacturer, we all want to help, but I think there needs to be a longer time period maybe to expect it, and more alignment amongst where do you want it to go, and then there's a course that we can hold to and deliver.
And is there any more clarity, because when we've spoken to manufacturers before, there's been a lack of clarity. Obviously there's an assessment process that's going on for the trucks to classify them. It's a star rating from
there's still
up
no
to 5.
bands as to where the
that's
stars are
what I
going
was
to
going
be.
to say. Have you been involved? Are you any the wiser as to what are your products?
Well, we're all involved
We're
all
with
involved.
TfL, we're all involved with Loughborough University, working to get to a point where they will then establish what the requirements are. So at the moment, I get customers asking me, how many stars have you got in your vehicles? I've got no idea, because it's not defined yet. And the challenge will be that the program that TfL are hoping to achieve, between when the stars will be defined and when we know what we've got and what we might be able to do to move from 2 stars to 3 stars, for example,
It's not long,
it doesn't give us the time to do it. They're trying to do things in a very rapid way, and understandably so. But these things, you need to be able to take them at the pace which the industry can follow, or you end up with a lot of chaos. I think one other comment to make about Direct Vision in London is that I don't see that as being the real answer. You give the driver more information, the driver's got more information, more confusion, more information overload. The real answer is when we put in a system like an advanced emergency braking system that we have for forward-facing collisions, and we do that to look at sides and right in front of the vehicle from the point of view of vulnerable road users. Take it out of the driver's requirements to make the decision.
One of the things I would say is that just give us clear guidelines. What do you want? And agree it across the metropolitan boroughs and in London. And manufacturers are very good at coming up with great designs once we know what we've got to design it for. And I'm a huge believer in devolved power, but there has to be coordination. You know, we have to have a single view that we're going to build to, and once we build to it, we'll meet whatever they want us to do, because that's what we do. We're there to build vehicles for the operations in which they'll run. So tell us clearly, we'll build them.
But none of us can produce a vehicle for London and a vehicle for Coventry and a vehicle for Birmingham and a vehicle for Manchester.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. There comes a point where, as wide as your product range is, that's not viable, is it?
But just going back, the problem is that it's the operator who will pay for that if we have to do different designs. And you know, margins are thin enough in logistics and in our business. We don't need that on cost. So,
and I'm sure a lot of the audience probably have already paid out on indirect aids as well. So, you know, we appreciate that. There's a lot of expense involved there, isn't there? We've just had, turning our mind to the future market, I suppose, we've just had belatedly, slightly, the SMT first quarter results. We had a largely flat performance, about 10,000 units sold. A bit of activity, I think, amongst the lighter, sort of rigid end. What's the panel's thought on what sort of year this will be? Because obviously we've had 3 consecutive years of growth, perhaps exceeding what we expected. I think last year was the best year since the sort of Euro 5 period. Any forecast? What's your feeling about this year? Is there any uncertainty, or do you think people are going to keep buying at the heavy and light end?
I think from our side, it's easier for me to say, I guess. From our side, we haven't really seen a reason to put the market down. We see it pretty much as in line with last year. I think definitely the first 3-4 months of this year, from our perspective, orders, everything else seems to be the same. I probably would say in the last couple of weeks, and I'm not saying from a DAF point of view, but just across what we see, maybe people are sitting on their hands a bit more with decisions. I don't think anyone's particularly losing business, but I don't know if decisions are forthcoming. Whether that will tail off towards the back end of the year. But normally the first quarter is, in terms of the first half of the year, normally is 45% of the annual registrations. So if you take that, then you will still be at a 40 to 43,000 market. Now, obviously, the second half of the year we'll see. But I think from our perspective, we see it as continuing as it has done.
Talking of a manufacturer who's in the heavier end, we see a slightly softer market this year, but nothing drastic. You know, there's no panic. The first part has been very, very good. For us, we've got some model changes, so that brings its own challenges. But we think the market's good out there. Operators are in good shape, and I think, yeah, we're happy. And I'll let Thomas say where he...
Sorry, Thomas, over to you.
Actually, for me, it's amazing to see being a newcomer in UK and being always obviously in our headquarters in Munich, where we discuss a lot about Brexit impacts and so on and so forth. And there it's more negative, and talking to the operators here in UK, everyone says thumbs up, this is great. And looking at the first quarter, and I've also did yesterday the comparison first quarter, where's the whole year gonna end up, the run rate, and if you just take the years from 2011 up to now, it might even end up from a mathematical point of view at 48,000 units, which is enormous. And it's quite interesting. Actually, I was surprised, I have to say.
Queuing that up perfectly, and I'm not going to lay into the Liberal Democrats like our chairman did earlier. But I mean, feel free if you want to, panel. Yeah. I was going to ask you, with obviously the election coming up on the 8th of June, if you had a wish list of things that our beloved leaders could do both for the industry but also for you as manufacturers, what would it be? And just taking on that and perhaps looking further afield, given your positions, what sort of support would you like to see as we obviously leave the EU over the next few years?
Well, I would like to see a swift deal with Brexit. As soon as we know what we've got to play with, then we can adapt our strategies to do it, to support the logistics industry. And, you know, we are where we are, so let's just get on with it, because in Britain we're usually good at adapting. So my wish is a quick deal with Brexit, and then we'll deal with whatever after that. And then, if we can remove red tape, unnecessary legislation to allow us to get on and do things quickly, make quicker decisions on things like platooning, so that we can get some of these efficiencies that we can see that we could have into the market.
Okay, gentlemen, anyone else?
I think the biggest issue is insecurity for our industry. Whatever decision will be taken, it should be fast, and it'll be a disaster for the whole industry if this is dragging now for years and no one really knows where we are heading to. So clear decisions, that's also mentioned by you, for the whole of UK, and also discussions about Scotland in and out or whatever. This is ridiculous. Just get clarity for us.
Is that Martin, Lawrence?
Well, I'll just agree clearly. Clarity is very important to get to the point where everybody knows where we're going and we get there quickly. Just moving it on a little bit, and I'll put on my alternative fuels hat for a minute. I'd like to see the new government come in and actually actively look to encourage the take-up of alternative fuel vehicles. There's a lot of words.
Do you feel it's been a bit
well,
lacking,
there's words. If I go back a few years ago, I attended meetings with various government departments, and all they were thinking was electric, electric, electric. And you say, well, on heavy trucks, you know, electric really isn't the sort of answer. Not you can't do it, but they're not going to be vehicles which will be a volume vehicle. You know, the answer is gas. And so for about 4 or 5 years, I would say, most of the people in the civil service looked at me and one of my opposite numbers from Mercedes as a couple of complete idiots who kept talking about gas. Which is quite interesting now that the politicians and the civil servants now seem to accept that gas is one of the technologies which will help on heavy commercial vehicles. And we have some help already in that the fuel duty on gas is lower than on diesel. But if the government are really keen to get the market moving quicker, they can actually give us some additional benefits and help.
Okay, just to finish, really, Lawrence?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general the same. I think, you know, with the DAF product range going from sort of the whole range, I think the cities thing's a big one for us. Obviously, we're quite big on, obviously, with Iveco into the councils and into those areas. So that inner city local legislation is a minefield. So I would definitely want to see some clarity on where do you want us to go. And I mean, I know we talked about Euro 7, fuel, whatever. I think, you know, some clarity for all of us in where do you want us to be in 5 years' time, you know, and that will then enable us to make sure that we could get there. So again, it is that focus. I think as well, when you look at, you know, the Transport for London and different things, what we're in danger of with some of these organisations is they give their standard for a city. It's not a law, but then it almost becomes a law, because if you haven't got that standard, you can't then quote on a tender as a customer. So I think, we need to be clear when do these things become compulsory or not as well. So again, it is that clarity of what do you want us to do when.
Excellent. I think that's a good note to end it on. Thank you very much for listening to our Future Truck presentation. Just like to thank the panel. Obviously, Lawrence, Martin, Thomas, Mark, thank you very much. Round of applause, please. But thank you.